Charles Murray is a W.H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He might prefer to call himself a curmudgeon, but I think Dr. Murray is one of our great Stoic public intellectuals. His best-selling political science work, including The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, In Our Hands, The Plan to Replace the Welfare State, and Coming Apart, The State of White America 1960 to 2010, takes a courageously unflinching view of what's going on out there. Dr. Murray's magnum opus may be Human Accomplishment, the Pursuit of Excellence in the Arts and Sciences, 800 BC to 1950, a book that, with his characteristic combination of humility and conceptual audacity, presents, quote, a resume of our species. The London Times Literary Supplement put it well, quote, Murray's methodology, supported by an astonishing amount of factual data and biography, helps make this the countercultural tract of the decade. Why countercultural? Because if you're a millennial like me, it may happen to challenge everything a postmodern, culturally relativist educational system has taught you. I called Dr. Murray a Stoic because he doesn't come across as having an axe to grind, but as being both blessed and cursed with a bigger picture view of history than that of his critics. Human Accomplishment will be the focus of our conversation today. We'll walk through the thesis, especially as it relates to music, and we'll consider the implications and talk about society and culture today. Charles Murray, thank you for joining us.
I'm looking forward to it.
We'll be looking at this more in depth, but right at the top, what are the factors, some of the factors that have to converge to produce high achievement? What was going on in Vienna in the 17th and 18th centuries?
Wow, you are starting in media res here, because this is way into the book when I finally get to these questions, but I'll try to answer it as best I can. And then we can loop around perhaps and come back to see why I got there. Well, in Vienna or in Florence back a couple of centuries before that, or in the other places where you had great fluorescences of human accomplishment, you had a few sort of basic things going on. One was you had cities that were cultural centers, and that is a very important factor in enabling a lot of this accomplishment to take place. You also had models. One of the best predictors of whether you have great achievement in generation X plus 1 is if you have great achievement in generation X. And so you have Plato, and then you have Aristotle coming along in the very next generation, and the same thing happened elsewhere. If you take it a little bit deeper than those kinds of enabling conditions, I think that, well, and here I'm pausing because there are lots of caveats to be attached to everything that I'm saying here, but there are a couple of things that are really important. One is that you have to have an organizing structure for whatever it is you're doing that has recently been infused with an exciting new capability. I'll give you an example. Music's a good example. The invention of polyphony. The invention of polyphony, where you can stack on notes on top of each other, just opened up a huge set of possibilities for music that until the invention of polyphony had not existed. And it sparked a couple of centuries of just towering achievement in music. The same thing happened in painting with the discovery, perhaps it's the rediscovery, the Greeks may have had it, but the discovery of linear perspective, and by the way, the invention of oil paints. And this leads to another consideration. Grant, you did ask a way too big a question to begin with, but I'll keep going for another minute or two. Something like oil paints gives a new capability of a kind of painting that technically couldn't be done before. Similarly, in music, you had to have the invention of better instruments before you could produce some of the kinds of music that you could produce in the 18th century, but you couldn't have produced in the 15th century because the instruments just weren't up to it. And finally, well, not finally, but I'll end with this element because it introduces a theme that we can probably explore usefully. I think that particularly in the arts, it is really critical that the culture at that time have a well-articulated sense of what are known as the transcendental goods. Transcendental goods being classically truth, beauty, and the good, drawing from Aristotle's notion of the good. And I'll just set this out as a rather challenging hypothesis that does go against today's non-judgmental culture, that unless works of art are infused with a well-articulated sense of truth and beauty and the good, they tend to be arid, ephemeral, sort of like eating a bowl of popcorn. They may be entertaining while you do it. They don't stick with you. And those kinds of works of art, whether they are literary or musical or visual, disappear quickly as well. Is that enough meat to get us started?
That is plenty. And we will loop back. We will loop back 10,000 years to the beginning of the Neolithic in the Middle East. One of the great things your book does is guide the reader towards a better sense of scale regarding history.
Oh, I'm glad you like that part of it. Nobody else has mentioned it that I know of. Yeah, this is when in the early part of the book, basically you've had civilization in any meaningful sense of the word only since the invention of agriculture. We're looking at roughly 10,000 years. And when I started the book, it occurred to me, we don't have a very good sense of how long things are. And so I divided history up into, I think it was 400-year chunks, and worked my way back, trying to give to people a clearer sense of the distance that separates us, let's say, not just from the Egyptians, but the distance that separated the Romans from the classical Egyptian civilizations. It was like so many other things in this book, Grant, which is I did it not to fulfill some noble ambition. I did it to satisfy my own curiosity. And this sense of a time scale is one of those things I was curious about and had a sense that I needed to understand better.
One of the side effects of this sense of scale, vast scale, and then you focus down to the window not of 8,000 BC but 800 BC to 1950 AD with the framework within which we find human accomplishment, is that it impresses on people that this didn't have to happen.
Yeah, that's true of so many things in the book. For one thing, think of all the time that went on from the invention of agriculture and through, by the way, some very impressive civilizations prior to 800 BC. But what happens in 800 BC? Well, we have the first works that are created that really last. You have Homer somewhere around that period. You have the Hebrew Bible that's being created around that time. You have some important stuff being done in South Asia and in East Asia. And from then on, we have an historical record which then goes through a long fallow period. You have a lot going on in the century CE, BCE, before the Christian era. And then you have this long fallow period for the first millennium of the Christian era. And then in this one small northwestern corner of the Eurasian landmass, you have an explosion of accomplishment in all of the sciences and all of the arts, which is, we don't think of it this way very often anymore. This explosion of creativity in those centuries is one of the marvels of human history. It is probably the marvel of human history.
polyphony is actually one of the 14 meta inventions that you identify, which are conceptual inventions like linear perspective, like ethics, like the scientific method. And what I don't want to repeat myself, but just to reinforce it, in reading your book, one appreciates the degree to which everything grew off of, clawed its way up previous accomplishments. And if there had not been certain breakthroughs like polyphony, logic was invented.
Yeah.
And then 2,000 years passed, and it was not invented anywhere else. We can't just assume that Aristotle's next door neighbor would have invented it 5 years later.
Exactly right. Now, the meta inventions, just to give your listeners the idea of things I have in mind besides the invention of polyphony and linear perspective and the scientific method, the invention of drama, opened up a whole new way of communicating in literature, just as the invention of the novel did. But again, these are things that did not happen in every civilization. For example, the invention of writing is something that existed in some human cultures, but did not exist in other human cultures. In the sciences, probably, it's a temptation to say all of this would have happened eventually. But think about China when you think about science. You had individual Chinese geniuses centuries and centuries ago, in a couple of cases millennia ago, who had true scientific insights into how the world worked. There is a description of the basic processes of geology that was formulated by a Chinese writer about 1,000 years ago that in effect anticipated the discoveries of Lyell and the other geologists of only a couple of centuries ago. But there was no scientific method in China. There was no way that insight could be built upon. You had mathematical insights. I mean, and the Chinese were calculating pi out to decimal places, even though they didn't use decimals, that wouldn't be done in the West for many more centuries. But they did not have a method of accumulating mathematical knowledge. So I'm just, in effect, providing some more evidence for your point. These meta-inventions are not something that we can assume were going to happen anywhere. And we most definitely cannot assume that a Beethoven or a Shakespeare or any of the other, or Michelangelo, that they necessarily would have existed no matter what.
Why have you determined that it is possible to identify excellence in the arts?
Well, this is this is one of the most interesting, I think, questions for millennials to think about because they haven't been taught it in school in most cases. And that is a long aesthetic tradition which says that it's possible to have a disinterested assessment of the quality of an artistic achievement. And that's not merely a matter of opinion to say that that's so. Let me take a trivial example, and maybe we can generalize it. This is one I think I use in the book, too. Let's say that you have a Titian nude, like the Venus of Urbino, and you have a nude painted on black velvet. Okay? Now, it is perfectly plausible for someone to say, well, I enjoy looking at the nude and black velvet more than I enjoy looking at Titian's Venus of Urbino. Fine. You can express what you personally prefer, but suppose we instead put it in terms of the use of painting as a technique. First, as a technique, there's no comparison really between the technique of a Titian and the person who painted the nude on black velvet. We can talk about the compositional features. We can talk about a whole bunch of things that somebody who knows a lot about art can spend hours talking about with the Venus of Urbino, and you can't spend more than a couple of minutes talking about the nude planet at painted black velvet. There is just a lot more stuff going on there in Titian's work than in the others. And the same goes with a variety of other things that seem to be objective but have an objective component. If you have people who know a lot about wine, and surely there's nothing more subjective than whether you think a wine tastes good, there is a lot to understand about wine, which lets you say that a particular bottle of a Cabernet Sauvignon from the Napa Valley is a better representation of its type than a bottle of Rhone from France. It's not that one tastes better than other necessarily, but there are ways of judging what the winemaker is aiming for that are objective, and that different people who are experts actually show a high degree of agreement on.
Yes, and walking through David Hume's division of sentiment versus judgment, it breaks down pretty simply. First of all, accept people vary in their knowledge of a given field. Nobody would deny that. The nature of a person's appreciation of a thing or event varies with the level of knowledge that a person brings to it. That's undeniable. And that leads to the disinterestedness, where you'll have, as Mark Twain said, Wagner is better than he sounds. Wagner's better than he sounds.
That's my view of Wagner, too. Yeah, I think that listeners who are raising an eyebrow at the idea that there are objective standards of excellence in the arts should think about some avocation or perhaps vocation that they're engaged in that they know a lot about. It could be woodworking. It could be, it could be music. It could be almost any kind of profession. And think about opinions of what you know a lot about that are made by amateurs and what you think of it. Because my experience is that when we know a lot about something, the fact is we may have furious arguments with other people who also know a lot about what our specialty, but at least our arguments are based on a sophisticated understanding of what's going on. Amateur opinions are often just simply stupid or uninteresting, things that we thought about long ago. If that's true of the things we know a lot about, as I think that most of us will recognize in our own experience, we should give the same credit to people who know a lot about music, know a lot about art, that they really do know a lot that gives them the ability to make disinterested judgments.
We face an additional obstacle in the realm of music because there is not a widespread, especially in regards to the popular music audience, there's not a widespread understanding of the fact that music objectively exists, that it manifests as sound waves, which are physical things like sculpture, that there are physical intervals, and of course that there are structural motifs playing out in the course of a work. And you end up with, let me read a quote, an infamous quote from the most popular indie music review site, Pitchfork. This is a 10 out of 10 review. So this is a glowing review of Radiohead's 2000 album, Kid A. Quote, "The experience and emotions tied to listening to Kid A are like witnessing the stillborn birth of a child while simultaneously having the opportunity to see her play in the afterlife on IMAX."
Wow.
And
that's kind of, talk about overwrought.
The whole review is like that. It's clearly written by somebody who doesn't know a lick of music theory and probably shouldn't be in the business of reviewing music at all.
Yeah, and there's another test we could talk about, Grant, which Hume himself refers to, and I think is really useful to think about, and that is Why is it that some things last and others don't? He observes that the people who loved Homer in ancient Greece and Rome, well, you still had people at the time he was writing in London and Paris who loved Homer. Why does he survive when others don't? Why is it that I'm absolutely confident that we will be listening to Mozart, we the Homo sapiens, as long as music is listened to? And ask yourself, how many people are going to be listening to the album that was just being reviewed even 20 years from now, let alone 50 years or 200 years or 500 years? And why is it that some things stick and others don't?
Well, we'll get into that right now. Shortly, I will read the top 20 that you've arrived at. But first, and this is the third point in arriving at the distinction between sentiment versus judgment. It follows that the relationship of expertise to judgment forms the basis for treating excellence in the arts as a measurable trait. That is what you're measuring in your whole book. It is an indirect measure of excellence, like we observe the tracks of subatomic particles. We can't see them themselves. So people should understand that when this list emerges, you're not...
I'm making it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me briefly describe the procedure, because I'm using a historiometric procedure that's actually been around in one form or another for 150 years, but has been quite well developed during the 20th century and is really powerful. And it goes along with the basis of expertise, includes an element of disinterested judgment. Okay, so you have a man, let's say, who writes a history of music. Well, he is not entirely unbiased. He has his own favorites. Some of that will seep into the amount of space that he gives to different composers, but he also has an element of judgment, which is he's going to give a lot of attention to the people that in his best professional expertise judgment belong there. Now imagine that you have 16 different historians of music from different countries, writing at somewhat different times, who are all talking about, here's what you need to know if you're going to understand the history of music. When you combine the amount of space that the 16 have given to different composers, you have a strong basis for saying, you know what? The ones that are getting way more attention than everybody else, with all these 16, are probably deserving of our attention more than those who are mentioned by only 2 or 3 and are given very little attention. So that's what I'm doing. I'm counting, when I went through this massive process, I am counting how much space is given to different artists by a whole bunch of different sources and constructing indexes, which for those in the audience who are statistically literate are incredibly reliable. But by reliable, I mean this. Suppose with the music index that I just used 8 of those 16 sources. And suppose I'd used the other 8 and made a completely separate index. So there's no overlap between the sources. The correlation between the ratings of composers by those 2 indexes would be in excess of 0.9. I mean, it's incredibly high correlation for the social sciences. These are really reliable in terms of the standards of the social sciences in measuring things.
The Western Music Index reliability is 0.97.
Yeah.
And you arrived at a list of 523 significant figures. I believe the cutoff for significant figures that they
have to be mentioned in more than half.
Yeah, that's it.
At least half of these sources, yeah.
But we see, and we'll think about why in a moment, but it rapidly stratifies at the extreme in a bit of an exponential way. So here's the top 10. Beethoven, Mozart, Johann Sebastian Bach, Wagner, Haydn, Handel, Stravinsky, Debussy, Liszt, and Schubert.
That sounds pretty much like what you predict, doesn't it?
Yes.
Now, mine.
And incidentally, even if an amateur listener had to make a top 10 batch of records to bring to a desert island, they would probably choose something close to that.
Yeah. I have to say, though, if you get fascinating, passionate arguments about the reordering of the top 3 or 4, that's true for all the inventories, but for music, perhaps more than any other, because you've got Mozart and Beethoven tied. And then you've got Bach third, and I've got Bach third and Wagner fourth. And first place, there are some people who are just outraged that Bach is not number 1. There are people so passionate about Bach. But the most common thing I get are people who are saying, Wagner is number 4? You got to be kidding. Which is why I put into the discussion there the comment of a good friend of mine who's also a professional violist. And when I was writing the book and I had the music index pretty much done, I said, okay, guess. Tell me what the top 4 are. And his immediate answer, without even thinking, he said, well, Beethoven and Mozart, 1 and 2, I don't know who's on top. And then his next statement was, who was third, Bach or Wagner? And what he was showing there, he's not just a professional violist. It's Miles Hoffman, who's, by the way, well known in music circles on PBS for his broadcast appearances. Anyway, Miles was reflective. It was very knowledgeable about the history of music and music theory and the rest of it. And so even though Wagner may not be one of his own personal favorites, his stature in classical music is simply so high that if you know a lot about it, you've got to put him way high on the list.
What is a Lotka curve?
The Lotka curve. This is something that I think ought to be way more publicized than it is. Because all of us, including me, intuitively would say these indexes that I prepared would show a gradual fall off. Yeah, Mozart and Beethoven may be number 1 and 2, but you'll have a gradual decline in these index scores that's fairly, a shallow slope. That's not the way it works. These scores, and I'm trying to get the listeners to visualize this, just plunge. It's almost straight. If you think of a graph, and the left-hand side of the graph, the percentage of people who are mentioned by just one source out of the 16 is going to be really high. The percentage that's mentioned by 2 sources plunges, and the percentage that's mentioned by 3 sources is already close to the bottom. So you've got a very steep fall off in the amount of attention, or in the amount of attention people get. This is true in almost everything. That you have, this was the Lotka curve, was named after Mr. Lotka, who discovered it when he set out to tabulate the number of journal articles in chemistry, I believe, that different authors had published. The most common number of publications was 1. The number of chemists who published even 2 journal articles was hugely lower than that. And the number who had published 5 or 6 or 7 gets to be infinitesimal. And then you get out to the people who have great careers as chemists, and they're published dozens of technical articles. They are a very tiny, tiny minority of all chemists. That's true in just about every field of excellence. There are a few people who dominate at the top. It's not a shallow curve. It is the giants, and then some semi-giants, and then everybody else.
People are going to wonder, surely some geniuses have fallen through the cracks. What's the case that they haven't?
Well, the case that they haven't, here's the geniuses who have fallen through the cracks. We can be absolutely sure, just from probability statistics, that we have had a number of people who have had Michelangelo's visual spatial skills and small motor skills. Okay? Just has to be true. the number of those who probably spent their lives as peasants in villages and remote corners of the world is very high, because that's, unless you live in a certain kind of culture at a certain kind of time, that genius is not going to be expressed. You're just not going to have any chance to express it. But let me give you another example of genius that doesn't get expressed because of culture, which is based on a thought experiment, which in turn actually comes from a science fiction story. Suppose that Mozart, with exactly the same musical skills, had been born in 1990, which would mean that, or 85, let's say, which mean, no, he was born in 1980. He'd now be as old as he was when he died, roughly. What can we expect that Mozart would have done? Well, I'll tell you what we can be absolutely sure he would not have done, which is write the Jupiter Symphony, or write Eine kleine Nachtmusik, or write Faust, or any of the other great works that he wrote. He might very well have gotten into music anyway, popular music, and he probably would have written some really sensational pop music or rock or something else. If he had the misfortune to become an academic composer, he probably would have written the kind of music that is enjoyed by academicians, but nobody else really wants to listen to. So you have a genius, same genius, Mozart, at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. Let me be brutal here. He would have produced stuff that was the best of its kind, but it would have been the best of a kind that does not permit all that much stature. There's only so much you can put into a pop song. Has that aggravated anybody?
I'm a songwriter, and that does not aggravate me at all. That's in fact my view of musical history. It kills me when I see an historically talented genius like Elliott Smith, who we've devoted 2 episodes to on this podcast, become a master of the Beatles' vein of pop rock songwriting, and incidentally have to waste a ton of his energy playing live shows and culturally being in the rock milieu, which is nihilistic for the most part, even if he resisted it and was a conservative aesthetically in certain ways. He ended up getting addicted to hard drugs and killing himself.
Mm.
It's just a waste. I wish there was a way to, I mean, I want to keep this more descriptive, but just speaking personally, I wish there was a way to bridge the gap, the chasm of the 20th century, and reconnect with classical aesthetics. I mean, I've tried to do that in small ways. I have taught myself string arrangements. I'm doing a residency at the beginning of next year in Portugal, and I'm going to be writing a mass. But it's not going to be the Missa Solemnis. It's going to be
no. You don't live in a culture which provides the potential for Missa Solemnis. And there's nothing we can do about that. We can't. A more accessible example, perhaps, to a lot of people would be literature and novels. And I'm not talking necessarily about, I'm not talking about abstruse novels or profound ones. I'm just simply talking about the novels people go back to because they get so much out of them and they love them so much. With Jane Austen being a good recent example. She's had a real fashionable period over the last couple of decades, but people go back and reread Pride and Prejudice several times. I know I have. You don't do that with very many modern novels. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the nihilism that you referred to, which is that it's not that the transcendental goods of truth and beauty and the good have to be expressed in saccharine ways. It is not that they have to be even obvious in the novels. truth, beauty, and the good are not obvious in Pride and Prejudice. It's just the story of a romance on one level. But on another level, it was written in a culture in which, how can I say this, in which a romance was a big deal, in the sense that it was going to lead to marriage and was going to lead to a lifelong companionship, whereas now, not just companionship, a lifelong intimacy, which is a defining feature of one's human life. Whereas now you tend to get in romances ones which are really cute in terms of their, the way they're written entertainingly. There is a kind of lack of a third dimension in them. And I think that third dimension is what I'm trying to inarticulately express with being infused with an articulated notion of the role of the transcendental goods in human flourishing. That was pretty obscure, I'm afraid.
I'd like to read from a zine. I don't even know if you know what a zine is, but
sort of.
A self-published thing. I don't know much about the author, but I know that he is a graduate of art school and that he ran a blog called I Will Literally Just Review Whatever Music You Send Me, which is now called Incontinence of Sound. And let's contrast this with Jane Austen. This is from his zine called Ceaseless Fun, as an example of the ennui. Quote, I could attempt to meet and sleep with women at the bar. I could attempt to make friends at the bar. I could attempt to network and find career opportunities at the bar. I could burden the bartender by talking to her at the bar. I could decide to test the bounds of social norms and act weird at the bar, yelling and dancing and looking around inappropriately at the people in the bar. I could devolve into nihilism at the bar, drinking and thinking myself into oblivion at the bar, fixating on various depressing topics such as the frivolity of a life lived going to bars. I could actively resist.
I love this.
I could actively resist the bar, struggle against the capitalistic power of the bar, liberating the deceived masses from the bar's draining grasps, ushering in a new era of post-bar society. It, goes on.
This is great stuff. Where is he going with it?
This is, I quote him because he's a very self-aware guy. He's got the diagnosis, but he doesn't see a prescription.
Mm-hmm.
And the path out for him is to basically appeal to some value that remains of truth. At least he thinks, he can maximize his truth regarding this nihilism.
Well, Grant, I think it's time for me to trot out the discussion I have toward the end of the book.
Yes.
Which is, the preface to that is that when I was in the process of writing the book, just beginning the book as a matter of fact, one of my colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute then was Michael Novak, the Catholic philosopher and social commentator. And he said to me very gently, in his gentle way, that he thought as I worked deeper into the well springs of human accomplishment and the source of human flourishing, that I would find that religion played a very big role. And I resisted that. My own position then was an agnostic, respectful of religion, but an agnostic. And I didn't see that, Plato and Aristotle lived in a particularly religious world. Oh, I should be more specific. He also said Christianity, not just religion, but Christianity was going to play a major role. So I resisted that. And where I came to rest by the time I finished the book was, first, I think a sense of a culture's religiosity is really important. And by religiosity, I mean a kind of coherent sense of the universe and why the universe is not meaningless. So that is not necessarily religion formally defined. Confucius was not, he did not form a religion in any sense of that term, ordinary sense of that term, but he had a coherent sense of the universe. And similarly, Buddhism does, and so do all the great religions, and so did Aristotle for that matter. However, the role of Christianity in Europe seems to me to be huge in fostering that explosion of creativity. And I think it goes back to Aquinas, where Aquinas shifted Catholicism from sort of being preoccupied with the next world and this world doesn't really mean anything, to a theology which says that God delights in having his universe explored and discovered. He delights in watching human beings do great things, and it kind of liberated. People think of religion as being a negative thing in creativity. I think it was a huge positive thing in creativity. But more generally, I think that we have a culture in which we have been indoctrinated, because it was certainly true of me. We have been indoctrinated to believe that only dumb people are religious, that smart people know better than that. And the fact is that an awful lot of us who hold this view, it's not that we studied Aquinas and decided Aquinas was wrong. We decided that the Sunday school stories we were taught at 7 and 8 years old are wrong. Well, that's a pretty trivial reason for not taking religion seriously. And ultimately, I'm saying that your friend who wrote that wonderful set of sentences about the bar, I just love them as I listen to them, is only going to be able to apply that talent to writing things that have a chance of sticking insofar as he can escape the nihilism. That great achievement in music or literature or the visual arts is incompatible with second-generation nihilism. By that I mean that you had some things in the late 19th century and early 20th century. I'm thinking particularly of Gide and some existentialist authors and others who were tearing down the temple. Nietzsche is an example of this, a very great philosopher in many ways. There is a lot to be done when you're tearing down the temple. But once the temple is down and it's all smoldering rubble, and then the next generation of nihilists tries to write something important or create music that's important or write philosophy that's important, what the hell are they going to work with? We're a bunch of chemicals. We're activated for 70 or 80 years. If we're lucky, we deactivate. That's all there is. The universe is meaningless. What the hell are you going to write that anybody cares about?
I think that is the great task aesthetically of this era, is affecting a reverse Nietzsche, affecting a
rebuilding the temple.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, I think that maybe we can be optimistic about this. Maybe I'm just looking for the signs I want to see. But the fact is that it is an absolutely instinctive human need to think about why we are here, to think about why there is something rather than nothing, one of the great questions of existence, to think about the cosmos. And it has been an anomaly during the 20th century that we have not. There is an analogy I have been using now. I've recycled it in a number of my works. I can't remember whether Human Accomplishment was the first place I used it. I don't think so. And anyway, the analogy goes like this. It says the 20th century was the adolescence of the human species. The reason I call it the adolescence is, think about what went before the 20th century, starting with the Enlightenment. You had the Enlightenment, which said that rationality is the solution to all of our problems, and religion is superstition. You had Darwin and evolution, which said, no, God did not create woman and man in his own image. We evolved from amoeba. You had the Freudian revolution, which was, of course, wrong in most of the specifics, but certainly true in identifying the subconscious motivations that we have. You had Einstein with relativity. In all sorts of ways, people who came into the early 20th century as intellectuals were looking at a series of body blows against the verities that they'd been taught by their parents. And just like adolescents, they assumed that because their parents were wrong about some things, they were wrong about everything. And they threw out that whole tradition and just kind of ignored it. That was the anomaly. The good thing about adolescence is that you grow out of it. And so my optimism is predicated on the idea that we, the human species, particularly in the West, are growing out of our adolescence, and that we are going to rediscover a spiritual dimension to life, which may not take traditional doctrinal forms, but I think it will build on those traditional doctrinal forms. I don't think we're going to discover truth in New Age stuff. It will take new forms over the next decades, but it will be the resuscitation of serious contemplation of the great questions and serious kind of labor that needs to go into developing a spiritual element in one's life.
People are asking, I don't believe, how can I just have faith? It feels like a regression. Let me read the final paragraph of Human Accomplishment, which has stuck with me and which I have internalized so much. I refer to it to tell people, to explain my actions sometimes to people, and so much that I practically forgot that it came from your book. This is an example of the action of faith, or faith in the sense of casting one's creative energies forward towards the future, towards an unknown, not just, aiming to get a review from a certain reviewer who you identify, but building a product towards something on the transcendental dimension. Okay, quote, "A story is told about the medieval stonemasons who carved the gargoyles that adorn the great Gothic cathedrals. Sometimes their creations were positioned high upon the cathedral, hidden behind cornices, or otherwise blocked from view, invisible from any vantage point on the ground. They sculpted these gargoyles as carefully as any of the others, even knowing that once the cathedral was completed and the scaffolding was taken down, their work would remain forever unseen by any human eye. It was said that they carved for the eye of God. That, written in 1,000 variations, is the story of human accomplishment."
Well, I still kind of get choked up when I hear that sentence, because I take it very seriously too. And I guess that as we come to the close of this, I would just add one more thing that I don't think is sufficiently recognized now. If you are going to try to acquire this kind of a spiritual dimension, it does not happen by sitting on a beach and watching a sunset. The great spiritual traditions, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or Taoism, any of the others, Judaism obviously, they require a lot of work. You do not suddenly, the skies don't open up. You don't have a Damascus moment. If you're going to acquire that, it takes work. It takes homework, takes thought, takes effort. It's worth it. That's the final thought I would leave one with.
Well, thank you so much for coming.
Human accomplishment is my neglected child. I have a lot of books. The Bell Curve was my abused child, obviously. But
not by you.
There was not by me. There were other books that did not get the attention I think they deserve. But human accomplishment is neglected in the sense that I think it's fun. Fun in the sense that it enables you to take a look at this tapestry of all the great things that human beings at their best have done. And what I think we have lost most in this era of non-judgmentalism is that by insisting, oh no, you can't say that this is better than that we deprive ourselves of the great pleasure in looking at Macbeth, looking at the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, or any number of other great works, and just exulting in what the human animal can do at the human animal's best. It's just lots of fun to glory in the ways in which human excellence have been manifested. And that's what human accomplishment set out to do. It took me 5 years. 5 years of the hardest work I've ever done. I wondered when writing the last 3 or 4 chapters whether I shouldn't just chuck the final part altogether because it was so hard. And it was my wife who pushed me to go ahead and complete it. But at the end of it all, I'm not saying this to sell books, by the way. It's not even in print. You can get a Kindle version, I suppose, but it's not in print. But at the end of it all, it's a way to establish a sense of kinship with people like Michelangelo and Beethoven and the rest. A sense of our human kinship with them that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So it's been a great pleasure for me to have had a chance to talk about my neglected child for an hour.